everybody. Thanks for joining the session. Today, we're going to be covering CSDM version 5, which was released during our Knowledge 2025 conference. And today, we're going to have Scott Lemm present a lot of the material, and I'll chime in as well along the way to present what's new from a marketing context. So with that, Scott, please take it away.
Thanks, Mark. I am so excited to finally talk about CSDM 5 as it's officially been released. Now, a few of the things we might touch on, we be forward thinking, so we just want to make sure everyone understands, don't make any business decisions on any elements that are forward thinking and not yet present in the platform. I've got a few things to go through today. I want to talk about our inspiration, our North Star, so to speak, of what we do for CSDM and where we're going. And then obviously start talking about CSDM in general, the enabling around that, and the CSDM 5 model, and then how all that comes together. When we talk about our inspiration, we want to make sure we're focused on the big picture. And for us, historically, we were focused on managing technology workflows and the various technologies within each organization. But we wanted to step back and make sure that we had a bigger perspective because we want to manage the entire business, not just the technology. And when we look at that, we start to think about a digital value network that isn't just about technology. Understanding what are the service providers to an organization, whether that come from a utilities perspective or any sort of service that could be provided to an organization that then gets consumed. We then aggregate that service inside of our own efforts of whatever we may be creating from a business so that we can take that, pull all those pieces together. How do we deliver what it is that we have as our organization so that we can distribute that to our customers, internal or external, via connected devices or other mechanisms. And when we look at those delivery networks, there are multiple delivery networks that come together. Some of the things that we own, some of the things we depend on third parties to provide and integrate with, being able to identify all of those elements coming together, not just the technology pieces. It's really our North Star. And that's what we consider a digital value network and the direction we want to go with CSDM in the future.
Yeah, what I really like about this, Scott, is that it really is forward thinking and making sure that we accommodate in our data model all of these areas, right? Third parties or internal disconnected manufacturing facilities or distribution networks and things like that. So that's really powerful. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that QR code that folks are seeing. That's how you get the paper that's actually being discussed here. So if you use your phone or your computer, grab that link from the QR code and you can download the white paper.
So generally the feedback that we've gotten about CSDM since CSDM 4, which we released 4 years ago, is that CSDM is hard. This isn't a simple effort to implement. It's difficult to understand, it's difficult to speak about, and how can we improve that and how can we help customers understand this better, speak about it much better? And that's also a large portion of the CSDM 5 white paper that we have moving forward. If we think about the environment, we have almost 2,000 customers that are utilizing the guidance provided from CSDM in one manner or another. If we talk about the roadmap session, Mark, that you had last year, you had over 3,000 attendees listening to the CSDM roadmap and the direction that we were looking to go with CSDM 5. And then, of course, these videos that we put together up on YouTube, we've got some of the top videos available from ServiceNow, and I'm sure this one will join that list as well.
Yeah, that's what we're looking for. And last week at Knowledge, I mean, we were probably one of the most busiest booths in the show floor and top attended topic across all of these sessions that we had. It was just crazy.
There's a lot of demand for information, whether it's what's coming out new or how do we utilize this effectively. And I always enjoy speaking to customers to see what their use cases are and how CSDM can help solve it.
And one of the things that we've also started to measure, a lot of folks do ask, well, what's the value for us in adopting CSDM and addressing CMDB challenges? And we put this slide together based on our own observations and engagements with customers. Over 400 customers went through impact sessions to evaluate their situation. And we also do farm scans that provide insight on how customers are doing in aggregate. And so as you can see here, by aligning your data to the CSDM model and also up leveling your data quality in the CMDB as a result, You see a huge improvement across the time to value, the cost reductions, because now you're identifying redundancies. You're also making your operational processes much more efficient and resolving issues much more timely. So there's a lot of advantages across the board. The other thing that's also very evident is that the CMDB maturity is really one of the core things that leads to the next key element, which is what we're calling CSDM maturity, to understand the service graph. Who uses what data that's represented in the CMDB? The next key layer is what most organizations are really trying to get to, is what I would consider Gen AI or LLM maturity. With bad data, an LLM, generative AI agent, is going to do bad things. So you need good data in, otherwise you will get bad results. So the need for data has been amplified by the automation layers that we're now implementing at this knowledge graph level.
I remember when we first started CSDM, pretty much the context was it's all about the data.
It's always been about the data, Scott, but now because these agents are using this data to make decisions and provide answers to others, it's really got to be right.
Agreed. So let's talk about CSTM5 and some of the new pieces we have in there. First off, I want to talk about the new graphics you're going to see in the white paper, as well as the graphics we're going to utilize in all of our presentations moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, CSTM is hard. We heard that from many folks. And as Rob and I discuss what CSTM is, and as Mark goes out and listens to customers and speaks to more customers, we started to think about what is it that CSDM is and how do we speak about it. And Mark and I were speaking to Rob, discussing our various elements, and Rob says, you're really talking about a service lifecycle as you explain CSDM. And in thinking about it in that manner, we started to work through that lifecycle type of view. And the story that we have starts with our new domain, ideation and strategy, where we have a new idea or a new concept. And that idea may be for something that's brand new, or it might be an enhancement to something we already do, be it a service or one of our products, some sort of process. But that idea becomes important. We want to capture that idea. We may move forward with it immediately and put resources and funding towards that idea, or we might say, not now, put it on the shelf, and sometime in the future, that idea is going to pop up again. We'll have that history, and maybe now is the right time when we move forward with idea. But capturing that and making sure that we have that information becomes extremely important. Assuming we move forward with that idea and we put resources to it, then we start our design and planning. What do we need for that idea to be successful? What are all the pieces and parts that come together, whether it be various software components, hardware components, service components? What are those things that start coming together that make that overall idea something that we can then build and deliver? So with that design, we hand that design off to the folks that will be responsible for the creation of that idea, whether it's building something new or integrating something that we get to procure. Those elements become extremely important so that we can release that idea for consumption. And so releasing that using something like DPR, our digital product release, then we have that into the service delivery, our area we are normally used to identifying in our CSDM, that then eventually gets consumed by their customers, whether those are internal customers or external customers. Underlying all of this is foundational data elements that supports all of this, and collectively together is the overall portfolio that we manage. Any one of these stages can provide feedback back to previous stages to improve the overall effort over time. In this particular view and in this particular discussion, we're not even talking about the data elements yet. We're just talking about CSDM in general and what the overall purpose and mission is of identifying the types of information and how it all comes together. This layer becomes the layer that we can discuss with management, with any level of management. They don't need to get into the weeds about the individual data objects that come together inside of CSDM, but here we can at least discuss the overall effort and how those domains come together.
Yeah, I really like this because it does fit, how we read things from left to right. And it was really hard to communicate or understand how that sequence works on the old graphic. And I'm really happy we're moving to this approach to align the data model to the natural order of things. And so it's so much easier for me to be able to explain it. But I think also, like you said, customers to understand it this way too.
And what I think you'll like even more is when we go to the next level of explanation, as this is more geared towards the architects to understand what is CSDM and how the pieces come together. Again, we're still using that base graphic, but we're adding a bit more detail here, where those domains aren't waterfall necessarily. When we start talking about ideation and strategy, we're really talking about the business model and the overall business, which exists throughout the entire life cycle. It doesn't just start in the beginning and we never come back to it. What is the business? What's the model for us to be in business? And then working with the enterprise architects to identify what is it we need for us to provide the business that we do. And once we have that identification of what we need, that's where we hand those off to the solution architects to fulfill those needs and make sure that we're releasing those as our overall service model so that we can consume that effort, whether it be through sales or support models. And that becomes that overall look from a business perspective. And I think architects get a better understanding of what we're talking about in CSDM when we start looking at it from this perspective, because you have various entities that come together at various sections overall, and we start to tell the overall story a little bit deeper, obviously, than we were doing before, but not yet to that depth of individual data objects.
Yeah, I like the overview at this level because, as you know, Scott, my background is enterprise architecture. And a lot of times how it fits into the ecosystem and where the importance and even the importance of the business model, how you, the decisions you make downstream are all predicated in how you operate your business as a whole. So this for me really resonates. And I think for at least my old crowd of EAs, I think it'll help get them motivated as well to see where they fit into this bigger picture.
Agreed. Now, when we look at how you get into that picture, so obviously that's a bigger picture, there's different layers, so to speak, that we start to focus on. And historically, again, most organizations are focused at that infrastructure layer, running a traditional discovery to find everything on the wire, so to speak. But there's multiple layers that exist in the bigger picture of a system. So obviously from an infrastructure at the bottom, it becomes important. On that infrastructure becomes the functional layer where we have certain applications, as an example, that are running on that infrastructure layer overall to provide a service and identifying those particular services that support overall process. Now, I just explained this coming from the bottom up because we have a lot of customers that are focused on that infrastructure layer. So this helps to see the bigger picture. For those customers that are more mature in that business process layer, certainly starting at that top and working the way down. But overall, together, collectively, this becomes that system model that we're working towards.
The one thing I would say is that we're able to bring together the different entities that typically occur to deliver on things at a very detailed level. One of the things I also want to mention is we're now able to document business processes using our own EA modeling capability and using BPMN notation. And we can connect the dots between the processes all the way down to the infrastructure layers down below, and that's kind of exciting. I've never worked anywhere where that's been possible, and so it just brings us to a whole new level of capability.
Agreed. Those entities are often siloed and very difficult to pull together, and it is exciting to have that in one spot.
Yes. It makes those processes more durable and useful after the fact, right? So they're just not documentation exercises. They're useful for impact analysis and doing risk analysis and business continuity management, all that.
And that's where you can identify criticality based off of the process being performed. When you go to application owners or service owners, no one wants to hear that they're not important, but the criticality really depends on the process that they support. Is that a process that is customer facing? Is that a process that if any element or stage of it is down, we're losing millions of dollars a second? Any of those type of processes dictate criticality, and others obviously become less important. But that's where pulling that all together in all of those scenarios you just mentioned make this a no-brainer.
Yes, agreed.
Now, I know everyone is familiar with the historical view of how we show CSDM. So the conceptual model with the colors and the boxes, identifying the particular relationships to each of the other elements. This is how we have traditionally shown CSDM since CSDM version 2. I will say this is the last time you're going to see this particular graphic in a white paper. We are going to move away from this for two reasons. One, this was one of the reasons why CSDM was difficult for customers to understand. There's a lot going on in this particular screen. And where do you zero in on? Where do you start? That's not necessarily apparent. Mark and I, of course, can explain this slide and becomes a bit more understanding. But at the same time, most folks look at it and they get confused right away. So that's one issue. The other is I can't even show everything in CSDM5 on this slide. There's a lot more that isn't even present here. And we'll get through some of those here in a moment. So in the future, once we get to CSDM6, this slide is unlikely to be present. And we'll be moving to a new graphic. And I'll give you a little glimpse of that in a little while.
Yeah, we're carrying a lot of the structure with us, but we're ordering it better, right? From left to right, and that's kind of predicate everything that they're going to see going forward.
And it helps reinforce the story that we want to have with CSDM versus just throwing everything up. So response so far, because we've had this out as a draft form for a few weeks. We've obviously already had this out released to the public to view for a week, and the responses have been fantastic. So obviously there's always work for us to do and some minor edits for us to fix along the way. But overall, from the review of the white paper as well as at Knowledge, so far we've got some pretty good responses.
Yeah, I would say this has probably been the most collaborative iteration, and it's been 4 years, right, since the last one. And so we've had a lot to kind of think about, and a lot more folks had chimed in and put their comments in, and then we've addressed a lot of them. I mean, we spent some late hours, Scott, making sure everybody's input was recognized.
And throwing out the draft a year ago at Knowledge 2024 and to get feedback from folks to say, is this a direction that would be favorable, really helped out because that some of the pieces that we'll get into here, we were able to tease out with customers over the past year, let alone the new graphics we've been working with for the past few months.
Absolutely. And the draft did have a few things we didn't get to, but we'll talk about that in a minute.
So with what's new, it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of scenario because from a CSDM perspective, we're focused on the data model, but we're also dependent on many of our business units inside of ServiceNow providing capabilities and functionality around said data model. So it becomes that chicken and egg. What comes first? Well, what comes first really is the data model. So in some scenarios, we have the data model present and not yet any sort of user experience associated to it, but those will be coming over the next year as the data model is present for those business units inside of ServiceNow to develop more capabilities around it. So let's talk about each of the domains and the elements that come into them. First off, of course, is foundation because that's underpinning everything we do in CSDM. And some of the elements that we've introduced in CSDM5, including value stream, isn't a singular object. Value stream is more of a concept where there are multiple tables that come together, identifying not only the value stream and how you would categorize it, but the various stages that come together within that value stream. And within each stage, being able to identify into other elements of CSDM to identify, for example, which business capabilities or which business processes support that particular stage in the overall value stream. And there'll be greater functionality provided in the future around the user experience of value stream and metrics coming together to show whether or not value streams are actually providing the value or the goals that they set out to achieve. But in the short term, we need a data model to help identify those opportunities. And so that is present in CSDM5 and in ServiceNow. And this also leads into the business processes that you were discussing earlier and the ability to draw out the business processes and the various activities within a business process utilizing our EA solution.
Yeah, I would also say that a lot of that stuff, where is business requirements that basically need to be understood before you actually work on the technology. And some folks are asking, well, why is this in the foundations domain versus some other domain? This is all information that's going to be used across the other domains. It's going to maybe be created one and used in others, or created in multiples, like the SBoM. We haven't even talked about that one, but that's all part of the rationale and why we decided what goes in the foundation domain.
Yeah, these are elements that are either referenced by multiple domains or utilized by multiple domains. So you just brought up SBoM. So that's one of the pieces I'm pretty excited about. And we're going to go into greater detail about SBoM and the use case around it in a little bit. But SBoM standing for the software bill of material and being able to identify the overall collection of components of a piece of software and why that's important. We'll walk through a particular use case. In that same area of product owner, you'll see product feature. And that's a piece that was introduced by our digital product release team, identifying that quite often when we develop and release new solutions, it's based off of developing a feature that is then realized within a particular version of software or services. And so that piece becomes important to us to identify what it is we're actually developing towards and what versions of what we release contain those particular features. So that's a strong element of our digital product release. Another piece you'll see here over in the data steward is the concept of teams. And that piece is an element we're extremely proud of for customers that would often customize the various CI forms and add additional contacts on a form. This is a related list that allows you to add as many as you want, contact groups associated with a particular CI, and then to categorize it. Within that, you can only use a category once per group, so you just have to make sure your choice list is unique. But that Teams becomes extremely popular and valuable for those customers that want to identify the various groups that may be involved with a particular CI or CIs.
Yeah, the other thing I want to add to that is that we are moving towards a more product-centric way of thinking, and team of teams or teams that work on certain products, all of that really matters. And it's also a good chicken and egg situation where we have the facility for those teams, and not every product that we sell uses it yet, but that's where we're going.
Another use case that we'll be jumping into it soon is our SecOps team, being able
Hmm.
to identify what team would be the response team for a scenario of, say, a vulnerability on a particular CI. And
Yeah.
so having that in that list rather than, again, adding yet another attribute to the CI form becomes much more valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to touch on knowledge. We added this, even though it's been around forever, Scott. I think this was sort of a last minute thing, but I found that the knowledge is the fuel for these AI agents. And
It
so
is
without knowledge, they don't know what's going on. And I'll give you an example. My wife works in HR. All the HR policies are in knowledge articles. And so when you put an AI agent on top that's using this knowledge articles, they have to be right. They have to be curated. They have to be managed, and it's been kind of lost in the weeds in over the years. So it's become more important now in the age of AI.
another piece for us to get involved with is the taxonomy of knowledge and making sure that is consistent with the other technology topologies that we have inside the platform because with so many, we don't want to have a disconnect. So not only is it the contents of that knowledge, but it's how it's organized as well.
Yeah, I mean it becomes an afterthought in a lot of cases, but now it's got to be a forethought because that's how you're training those agents. And if the knowledge is wrong, guess what? The agent's going to be wrong.
Yep. So moving forward into the domains, again, the new domain that we added in CSDM5 is ideation and strategy. And if we recall on that single slide that shows most everything on it, that's the old view, it didn't even have all of the objects. So there's actually 6 objects inside of ideation and strategy, aside from the product idea and planning item. We want to make sure that we identify the overall strategic plan, its prioritization, the goals and the targets we have for those goals. And this becomes extremely important to identify that very beginning in the business model. We mentioned earlier that business model becomes that overarching everything that we do, and being able to identify and relate back to those helps us understand and validate that the work that we're doing is supporting the value and the strategy that the organization is trying to achieve. The other element you see here, and this is one of the things I'm really excited about in the white paper, and that is you'll see at the bottom, we're identifying foundation elements. In the past, we would discuss the foundation domain as we just did, and then never talk about it again. Instead, within the white paper, what we're doing is within each domain, we're talking about specifically which foundational elements are important for that particular domain. So looking at these particular 6 objects, which foundational elements are important for ideation and strategy. And as you see examples here being value stream and value stream stage. So this is a deeper element inside the white paper where it's not just talking about domains, talking about objects, but then why are they important, how they work together, and what do you start to achieve. So that's a new section we're excited about. It's just brief introductions of those at this time, but in the future, we expect more content to revolve around those topics.
Yeah, and also I guess these are now out of the box. I know a lot of this stuff that we're talking about now may have been part of a specific product, but in keeping with our CSDM principles, these are now out of the box. Is that right?
That is the core principle that we established in the very beginning of CSDM. And yes, that's the effort for all objects that we discuss inside of CSDM, that they are available without licensing. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all in the family release. They might be part of store apps that you can download at no cost. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's all in one spot, but they're all available with no extra licensing. And that's important because we want customers to use the right table for their data as opposed to obviously the wrong table or custom tables. So if the right table is one that traditionally is used by a particular solution of ServiceNow, at least use that table. And in the future, if you weren't licensed for it and you want to be, you at least have the table in the right spot. Your implementation time goes down, your implementation cost goes down.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight that I know a big part of your job and others here is to figure out how to make those available if they're buried, right? And that takes some time sometimes.
It is. I heard cats. That's one of my
Yes. Chief Cat Herd.
So when we move into design and planning, again, you'll see better here that foundation view where we identify specifically which foundational elements are important to this particular domain. Now, we haven't made any changes to this domain. So design and planning are the same three objects that we've been showing since previous CSDM versions. Now, with our draft previously last year, we were saying business application may change to digital product. Now, that's not going to happen anymore. Working with customers, socializing that with existing customers as part of application portfolio management, now enterprise architecture, it was understood by that business unit, ServiceNow, that a change of that label would not be favorable. And so we took a step back, and now we're looking at a different solution going forward to identify a digital system of which a business application is part of that overall digital system. So more details to come on that as that's kind of forward thinking, future thinking of what we might want to do with CSDM6.
Yeah, and we're making sure that we don't break our customers. One of the things a lot of customers always ask me is, well, is this going to break what I use? And largely we don't want to do that, right? There may be some small tweaks here and there, but it's all supporting going forward, right? So if you're using CSDM now, the next version is going to be supported and brought forward.
The last thing I ever want to do is take something away. I'll joke that I don't mind saying I'm wrong, but I don't want to be wrong if I don't have to. So in that scenario, I don't want to take anything away.
Yeah.
CSDM and the next version is always additive. We might relabel a few things, but we don't want to take anything away.
Yeah. The one thing that's kind of interesting too is that as I talk to customers of business that use business applications, they find a lot of those aren't really business apps, but they're using that table anyway because it's the only way to characterize the funding and getting an app ID is required for funding activities and assignment of resources.
Yeah, an
So
app ID isn't always an app. Yes,
exactly.
that's exactly the concept that we're thinking about when we start talking about a digital system, because there's multiple pieces, components, so to speak, that come together into that digital system. It's not always code. Now, code is present. We want to make sure we identify that. But how do we also identify the other things, to your point, that aren't code, that aren't app, but they still want an app ID, so to speak? And so that's where we can start talking about the system as a whole and then its individual components. And that's part of what we're working through the next few months as how we define those particular elements and make sure they come together. And we're hoping that that is a critical part of our CSDM6 release.
Yeah, yeah. And in customer conversations, between 18 and 34% of their business apps aren't really business apps. And one customer I talked to not too long ago called them dumpster fires because they're so far removed from what a business app is, right? But they have to use it anyway. So
Well, we have another scenario of that we'll talk about in a little bit that we were able to solve in CSDM5.
excellent.
So build-in integration, this space, one of the pieces I'm excited for because we've been working on this for several years, and that is what we talked about previously about objects being behind licensing. And so the DevOps change data model, understanding the actual data model around DevOps. Now, this isn't customers performing DevOps in ServiceNow. We don't want that to happen at all. This is the data model that's used to integrate wherever DevOps is being performed. But we want to pull those pieces in because they become important to us so that we can manage the digital product release of those objects and kind of put some visibility and possibly some gates around all of that. But we needed to have that model out of box, and that'll be apparent in a scenario I'll share here in a little while. So that's one big piece. It's important to identify that historically, CSDM is focused on the CMDB. And where do I put data within the CMDB? The DevOps change data model does not live in the CMDB. It lives in its own data model. So this is an example, just like the ones we were doing in ideation and strategy, of objects that are not in the CMDB, but we're still pulling them together because they're important to the overall lifecycle story, especially as we shift left and identifying how things got into operational status to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one because the AI revolution or evolution is really a high concern for most organizations I speak with. This allows us to capture that, like you said, early in the stages of implementation before they go operational and put the right governance processes in place.
And as we talk about AI in this particular domain, the AI digital assets is an asset. Now, traditionally, when we talk about assets, we're talking about instances where we've got an asset and then it's also connected to a CI. These particular assets break that rule where there is no CI whatsoever because these assets represent a deployable, not something that's been deployed. So this is an artifact that's ready to be released and used, but it's not released. So that we want to make sure that the fact that we have something that can be deployed is also managed and understood as well.
Yeah, I liken it to the storeroom. Stuff's in the storeroom, hasn't been deployed yet, but you can at any time.
Yeah. And once it's deployed, it will be a separate object.
Yeah. And it's the traceability between the planning and development activities to operations, which is important to trace.
Moving into operations is that's what we're into next. That's our service delivery. And this is that example where you mentioned earlier about people who are putting data into business application that's not business application. We have a similar scenario here. And this is where we have to take that 30,000-foot view and start looking at not just technology, but what are the other types of instances of services that we manage. So historically, when we look at this screen, we expect to see application service because that's what we normally start to manage at this point, where our focus was on technology workflows. But there are many issues with application service. As you mentioned with business application, a lot of customers were using that table to put things that weren't applications and really blowing up that table for things that it wasn't intended to do, which resulted in performance issues and some other pieces. In looking at how that table was used, we want to fix obviously the performance issues, but we also want to fix the fact that customers were using it for things it wasn't. So, taking a step back, looking at application service, the way you and I have historically explained application service is that it's an instance of a business application. So that instance word became extremely important to us, and then an application service is a service. So what if we looked at these as service instances, of which application service is one type of a service instance? And we could have many more types of service instances. And that gives us the opportunity to start breaking that up into other types and provide more tables, which we'll get into here shortly. So again, stepping back from a pure focus on technology workflows, what if we could manage any service instance? And now that gets back to our North Star vision of being able to manage more than just technology. Now, when we have a service instance, it has to be delivered somehow. So the collection of objects that come together to represent how that service instance is delivered becomes a service delivery network. So it's not an object on its own. This is that collection of objects that come together, the collection of CIs as an example. And we'll walk through a traditional example of this in a short bit.
Yeah,
Other objects that we've historically had, technology management service used to be technical service, and we've relabeled it. The technical service offering is what we previously identified, and we've relabeled it. So both of these, the technology management service and the technology management offering, are previously the technical service and technical service offering. All we did was relabel it. The objects are still there. Nothing else has changed. Same with Dynamic CI Group, still there. Nothing has changed.
I would only add on the technology management service, this helps to distinguish what it's for. A lot of folks get confused about the difference between a technology and a business service still. these are the folks that manage those technologies and provide them to others. That's really the need to create them and the purpose for this particular entities.
Agreed. And then
Yeah.
you'll see down the foundation level what objects are important inside of service and delivery. And you'll see SBoM here come into play. And again, we'll talk about a scenario here using SBoM in a little bit.
Yeah. The other thing I want to also recommend is if folks are using the service auto table for their application services, they really need to look at using some of those sub classes, the true app service types based on their population method. That will help longer term in order to manage them and differentiate them at this service instance level.
So let's talk about those choices. So service instance, as you said, underscore the name is CMDB CI service auto. That previously was labeled application service. Hanging off of that was four tables that could be application services, depending on how you manage them. So mapped application service being either manual mapping or service mapping, calculated application service obviously being the calculation method, tag-based being the tag method, and then dynamic CI group if you want to use queries representative of an application service. So those tables haven't changed. Application service is still there and within those four tables. It's just the top layer that those four tables extended from we've relabeled a service instance. And with that, we've added five more types of service instances, which are their own tables extended off of CMDB CI service auto. And so from there, we've got data service instance, network service instance, connection service instance, facility service instance, and then operational process service instance. We may add more in the future, but we're confident these are a good start. When we start talking about AI, that's part of the data service instance and extension off of it. If we're talking about telco, then that's important for the network service instances and the connection service instances. The operational process service instance becomes important for OT, for manufacturing, for utilities, all of those elements to identify what pieces come together to deliver an overall instance. Now, as you mentioned, these are new tables. And use of these tables are completely optional at this time. This is an example of chicken and egg. We have the data model present, but if you wanted to create an application service, you still go to the application service wizard. You still create an application service as you've done before. But at this time, there's no user interface for the service instances. We're working on that with the expectation that will be released early next year, 2026, around now's timeframe. And we'll have a new experience around the creation of any service, not just service instances, but it'll include business services and technology management services as well. So that's a piece we're excited for, but it's just not there yet. So the business units will be working on that user interface and making it simpler to create a service. So that's music to my ears because I want to make it easier for customers to get into using the guidance inside of CSDM, and that'll be a key element there. So in the short term, yes, the tables are there. You could use them, but only if you necessarily need to have to. It's not that we're forcing you to move into them right away.
Yeah, and I want to mention two more things. So you mentioned the chicken and egg, and that's kind of the case with the service instance renaming. That happened back in our Yokohama release. So that's now out there. And so not all the user experiences have been updated to account for the fact that there's this new base class name and the app services are still there as they always have been underneath it. That's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing that I really wanted to point out is that the use of these new service instances, that's also all roadmap, right? I mean, we're working with our product BUs to kind of align their roadmaps with some of these changes, which takes time. And so customers really just have to be patient, but also don't go crazy if it even though it is optional, because our use of these are coming.
Next up, I want to talk about that delivery network. And the example we've always had is based off of the technology workflows in delivering an application service. So in this scenario, this delivery network is for an application service. And we have identified API. And even though this has been out for a while from a data model standpoint inside of ServiceNow, it was absent from our documentation. So we wanted to make sure that we are representing it. API is actually a larger collection of tables. It's not a single object of CMDB CI API. So there's much more to this. And so there'll be additional documentation in the future around the use of API and recommendations on API, how the elements can be populated and the overall API management. Traditional pieces, as we've always had, application being that middleware, anything that's discoverable by discovery or integration of discovery that allows you to identify and populate the application table or Apple table and all of its extensions. Two pieces that are new for AI. We have AI function and AI application. The large differentiation piece really is AI function is what's provided from a SaaS perspective, often a third party, and AI application is what's discoverable on-prem. And so that becomes that separation. And of course, what we might have discoverable from our hosts, whether they're on-prem or virtual, any sort of OT and networking pieces coming together to represent the overall pieces and parts that deliver a application service in this scenario.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that we also have a new solution coming out this year in 2025 called API Insights, which is the main driver for that new API class. And there's a set of Service Graph connectors that tap into different sources of API information. So that might be of interest to the folk. The other interesting thing is like OT is sort of a big bucket, and there's a lot to that. And of course, SBoM shows up here. I don't know if you want to say a few words about SBoM and SBoM components.
Well, we'll get into how SBoM is used as in a use case here shortly. But you also bring up the fact that there's a lot of examples that could come from an OT perspective as well as the API. The white paper that we release isn't meant to provide examples. The white paper is meant to define the objects and identify how those objects work together. What we will be presenting in additional documentation and enablement are examples to all of these pieces. And so from an OT perspective, having the various industries represented that fall under that OT bucket and how do those delivery networks come together to provide those particular capabilities. That'll be part of the examples and use cases that we'll be providing here in the near future.
I did want to mention that on the examples, it's now create is the source of those examples, and then mine it's all been rebranded as of Knowledge 2025 to something called Mine Now. So mine out at servicenow.com gets you to a lot of resources you can tap into across all of our different resources.
You mentioned earlier about the instances, the service instances being available as of Yokohama. And within Yokohama with that release, we also updated the nav bar, the left nav bar, to identify those service instances as well as the label changes that we have. This comes in and it's not optional. So as soon as you upgrade to Yokohama, these values will be present. So there's nothing to turn on, they're just automatically there.
Yep. Yep. And so this is good. And this is just a snapshot from the class manager so that you can kind of see how it would look in the actual user experiences.
So the last domain to discuss here is service consumption. Again, we haven't made any changes, but we do identify what foundational elements are important for this particular space. You'll also have noticed it's not just the label of a particular table, the name of that table. Where appropriate when it comes into services, we've identified the service classification and what classification should be utilized for that particular object in this particular domain. Within the white paper, we've done a better job of identifying and understanding what is service classification, why does it exist? It's a legacy object that has been there since the dawn of services, and understanding that this is a piece that, albeit legacy, is something that we continue to utilize in very specific scenarios, and we identify that inside the white paper. Next up, let's talk about life cycle stage and status. As you can see, we've updated the graphics to align with our new CSDM graphics and color schemes. This that we show here is kind of the everything. So it's all stages, it's all stage statuses, and then identifying which objects inside of the platform utilize those stages and those stage statuses. So this is kind of everything on one screen. And then of course we break it down as we've done in the past, identifying what would be tangible or physical. In the past, we've identified these as hardware. We're no longer using the term hardware. So the new term to use in this space are objects that are tangible or physical. And again, we start to show more of a flow in this and how it matches the overall CSDM effort. We do the same thing from an intangible and logical perspective for those pieces that wouldn't necessarily be assets, as an example, and making sure that we can tie those pieces together. What we also did in the white paper is something that we've had a request for a long time. And that's the definitions of all of those stages and all of those stage statuses. So you can go to that white paper using that QR code that Mark identified, and you can get those definitions for each of those pieces. Now, the next piece I want to talk about is one of the things I'm really excited about what we were able to accomplish in CSDM5. Inside of the platform, historically, we've had a need to identify a software version. And the only object we could really utilize in the platform at that time was the software model. Now, software model has a version attribute on it. It's also a critical component of our SAM, Software Asset Management Foundation's capability. The problem, though, is it's not meant to be utilized for other parts of the platform. It was really meant to be utilized and configured for software asset management, but we have other use cases where we want to identify the version of software, and we'll walk through one of those in a little bit. So what we needed to do was solve a problem of if we have a current object that is software model, but it shouldn't be utilized because it's primarily for software asset management, then what do we do instead? So let's walk through this use case and we'll explain what we did. So again, looking at our overall effort, the use case begins with a vulnerability. So a vulnerability comes in from the SecOps perspective, and most often a vulnerability comes in on a piece of software, a very specific version of software. And this is that scenario where we needed an object. But as I said, software model was not that object. That's something that SAM team utilizes. And if we use it for elements that aren't for software asset management and entitlement management, it ends up breaking SAM. So we needed something else. Working with many stakeholders inside of ServiceNow, we came to a conclusion. We needed an object that we call software component model. So this is another product model extended in the overall hierarchy, and we document this inside the white paper. And this is meant to be a product model for all code. All code whatsoever that is versioned will have a software component model. This is separate from the software model, as the software model is meant for entitlement, things that you manage from a software asset management. You may procure and have a particular model that you have inside of your organization. But this is meant to be code, specific code, 10.456, that is found inside of the organization. Now, that code may relate to a software model, but this isn't one and the same. So we created this new object. Again, the white paper has details on that hierarchy and the various pieces of it. But in this scenario, we have a vulnerability. It's to a particular software component model. If we're lucky, that is a monolithic piece of software, and we have that related to an application service, so we know where that exists operationally. But that's not often the case. Most often, a vulnerability isn't to a monolithic piece of software. It's made to a component of a larger piece of software or a component of a component. There's no limit to where a piece of software component model may exist in a hierarchy, but we want to use the SBoM. So this is where earlier we were talking about SBoMs, the software bill of material, which is essentially saying for a top element, it has build components. What are those pieces? So the SBoM is referencing software component model. So identifying what's the larger top element, and then what are all of its components. And any one of those components could also have components. And so this is a large potential hierarchy to identify where that vulnerable software could exist inside of our organization. Now, one of the things we want to do is not just focus on what's operational, we want to shift left. With that, from our digital product release solution, we want to be able to also utilize that software component because as we release into our organizations, we want to reference those versions of software that we are releasing or versions of services. So we want to identify that software component model, but even more so, we want to identify all of the pieces and parts of that build effort. So this is why that DevOps change data model becomes important, and we want visibility into it because we want to be able to identify all of those pieces as they come together that represent that software component model that it's being released into the wild. And in using DevOps change, we want them to be able to create an SBoM, which is a development SBoM, to identify what are all of the pieces and parts inside of what could be released. And if, for example, we have a vulnerability on any of those objects, let's stop it from being released. Let's not create more problems. So let's pause it and put a gate using policy as code, PACE, as part of ServiceNow to identify where those vulnerabilities may exist on those components that are part of what's being released. We can step back even more to the left and look at EA from a design standpoint. And as they go through and start designing objects that need to be built into the wild, let's catch where those vulnerabilities may exist and be related to. Now we need to populate those software component models. Obviously, vulnerability can help. Obviously, there's some other elements, but the SAM team created capability utilizing the traditional discovery that anything is found with a version associated to it inside of an organization can be populated as a software component model one-to-one. So all of this starts coming together as the overall story that we want to tell. Fortunately for us, the SBoM has existed as a out-of-box object available to be used as of 2024. The software component model was created at the start of this year, and then more recently, our digital product release team has updated through a App Store release their solution to use software component model. And as I mentioned, the SAM team getting involved, they have updated their store model release to be able to populate software component models directly from their discovered sources. So the whole picture isn't completely there yet, but we're definitely well on the track to get this completely solved. And the core of it was the creation of this software component model tied to our SBoMs.
Yeah, so a little chicken the egg, right? It's new. Not all the product teams are using it yet, but now the path forward is clear. I like that.
And when this is completely done, that's where we do a dance.
Yes, a big happy dance.
So again, as you said, not everything is there yet. So we have the rest of it that is planned. So that includes the EA team updating TPM and TRM. There's other elements coming together to finish it all off and make sure that it can be populated, including ITOM coming in and creating SBoMs themselves. So there's a lot of pieces on the plate to help finish this off, but we're well on our way. So overall, as I mentioned earlier, I heard cats. So there's a lot of business units inside of ServiceNow, and we start looking at the overall data model. What is that bigger picture? And as I mentioned earlier, there's the view that we've often provided when it comes to CSDM that doesn't have enough space really to include all of the objects and how they tie together. So one of the things we're working for in the future is to provide a new view of the data model. And what we show here is actually a draft we've been working for towards our CSDM 6 that starts to show all the objects and how they come together. But more importantly, we want you to see how the various products and solutions that we have from ServiceNow, where they fit in on that overall data model. And this isn't necessarily everything. We could add more to this overall layer, but it starts to give you an idea of, based off of that overall model that we have for CSDM for the future, where do the various pieces come together and what uses it? And it starts to give you an idea of where to focus, so to speak. So if all I want to do is ITSM with some ITOM, then there are very specific objects that I need to focus on to accomplish that. If I'm going to be doing hardware asset management or software asset management, which objects become important for the activity that we're doing? So not only are we going to provide a larger data model in the future with CSDM 6 and replace what we've been using in the past, but we also want to make sure everyone understands at that point, we'll also be able to help identify how to implement based off of what products you have licensed and what you've already populated inside of the overall repository.
Yeah, this is key because the objects aren't theoretical, right? This data model is not theory. It actually is there to power how these products work and work together, more importantly. So that's not so clear. And now when we're working with our doc team, the whole documentation site's getting an overhaul and it won't be ready till late this year either. So when the new doc site is actually ready, it will accommodate scalable vector graphics so you can zoom in and see the detail. And there also is going to be potentially a login required to see some of this detail because it is considered somewhat confidential. So that's something to keep in mind.
Now, Mark, because we've both been getting the messages, a lot of people really like this idea.
They love
And
it.
and that's why I'm excited to have this replace that old view of what we did with CSDM. But it's not done yet. This actually is forward thinking where we've got a lot of the elements that will be part of CSDM 6 in it. So our goal is actually we're going to release this as part of CSDM 6, even though we reference it here with 5. The feedback that we've been getting has been fantastic, so it supports the direction that we've been going. So we will make this available, but not until CSDM 6. Until
Yeah.
then, you can see it from this view and identify what portions of our products work with what elements of the overall model.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited because I have an electronics background, so looking at schematic diagrams is I'm very comfortable with that. So folks that can, grok the detail, they're all looking forward to that detail, and we just can't wait.
So that becomes, in essence, the overall effort with CSDM5 and what's new with what we've provided. A lot of it is new graphics to help organizations understand what CSDM5 is and how to explain it to others. And then, of course, additive elements for the overall data model so we can expand and manage the whole business and not just technology workflows.
Excellent. All right. So I think that concludes our session today.
That's it.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for listening. We're going to provide links to the community. You can get the URL for the white paper there. We'll put the URL from the QR code there so you can click on it in this video. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Scott, for making this happen. It's been a long 4 years.
It's been a long 4 years and a lot of people helped contribute. So thank you to them as well.
Yes, thanks. Shout out to everybody that has had their fingers in this, but it's a much better result, and I think it'll take us to the next level.